Children in hunger. As the world prepares to celebrate Food Day, many are warning that the hunger crisis for children is worse than ever. Just what does it really take to save starving kids around the globe? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sahil Rahman. For the first time in history, more than 1 billion people are chronically hungry and over 400 million of them are children. Aid agencies and even the United Nations are warning that that number's set to rise if something isn't done. Here's Bethan Howe with more on the facts and figures that are causing concern.
Approximately every 6 seconds, a child dies from hunger-related causes. That means 240 more will have died by the time you finish watching this programme. It's in the developing world that things are at their worst. Here, conflict and fallout from the economic crisis means 947 million people are undernourished. Drought is also adding to the food crisis in places like Guatemala and East Africa. In Ethiopia alone, 3 million children are in urgent need of food. The world's population is continuing to grow, so the number of mouths to feed is increasing. By the year 2050, it's estimated we'll need 70% more food to meet the demand. The plight of starving children does seem to be shocking world leaders into action. They've pledged support for a $22 billion food security initiative, and US President Barack Obama has outlined a new strategy to fight hunger.
Well, joining me on the programme in Washington, D.C., Margaret Schuler, Associate Vice President of Save the Children. Also in Washington, D.C., Dr. John Hoddinott, Senior Research Fellow for the International Food Policy Research Institute. And in Rome, Mark Smulders, Senior Economist with the FAO Food, Security and Agricultural Projects Analysis Service. To my guests, welcome to Inside Story. Margaret Schuler in Washington, D.C., could I begin with you? Why should the world be shocked that 400 million children are starving? I mean, hunger and starvation has been here as long as, well, time and records have begun.
Well, I think people should be concerned because over the past few years, as the global food crisis has hit and prices have risen, poor countries around the world have been most severely impacted. So even though we hear things in the news about more wealthy countries pulling out and recovering from some of these shocks, it's the poor countries that are impacted the greatest level, and children in particular in households in those countries are being impacted the most. So we should be concerned, and agencies like Save the Children and others are working to address these hunger concerns around the world.
Dr. John Hoddinott, if I bring you in here as well, are the figures any more startling than they have been in the past? What's changed so much to bring them to the forefront of debate across the globe?
Well, if you look at the historical record and you went back, say, 50 years, you would see a world in which there are probably 800 or 900 million people who are considered to be hungry. Over that period, until very recently, gradually that number went down. And if you looked at that number as a percentage of the world's population, it was actually dropping pretty fast. But in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a big uptick in the number of people who are considered hungry. And I think this uptick, this reversal of the historical trend, is what is driving concern about this issue.
Mark Smulders in Rome, could I just bring you in here as an economist? Perhaps you have a particular stance as an economist, but what actually concerns you about these figures and the circumstances in which they've been released?
Well, as Margaret and John have both said already, that our main concern has been that we weren't making all that much progress on the numbers of hungry people over the past 2 decades, in fact. And now with the high food prices in 2007-08 and economic crisis since last year, yeah, the numbers have really gone up, our estimates of the numbers of hungry people. So it's clearly having had a big impact on the purchasing power of many poor households, these two crises. And the worst, of course, is that the economic crisis came on the heels of the high food prices crisis. So households, particularly poor households, have been very hard hit, and their purchasing power has gone down tremendously, including their dietary diversity. So it's having a very negative impact.
Dr. Hoddinott, I hate to play devil's advocate, but I have to, perhaps in this particular position. But isn't it just scaremongering when we're hearing about these figures sometimes in general terms, and that at this moment in time, perhaps the focus is perhaps related to the fact of the downward spiral within the economy across the globe? If that hadn't been the case, would we have still had the same problem?
I think we would have had the same problem even in the absence of the global financial crisis. Arguably not quite as severe, but a big problem nonetheless. I think it's one thing which is worth reminding ourselves is when we see photographs and video clips of hungry children, one can see right away an intrinsic, a desire in itself to ensure that no child around the globe goes hungry. But it's also important to note and to understand that being hungry today as a very young child carries lifelong consequences. We have excellent evidence now that's suggesting that children who are malnourished at age 3 do more poorly in school, they're likely to drop out earlier, and as adults they earn considerably less. The people who should be really worried about this crisis right now are actually finance ministers in developing countries, who, when they see rising numbers of malnourished children, are actually seeing a diminution in the economic product potential and future productivity growth of their economies.
Well, we'll move on to how the politics of this actually will work and affect itself. But if I come to you, Margaret, in DC, what parts of the world or the globe are actually the main cause of concern for the moment with regards to what John Hoddinott has already said?
Well, places like East Africa, which kind of has chronic food insecurity in some countries and chronic series of droughts, are of concern. Places like Guatemala, which has not in the past been a place where we consider there to be significant levels of food insecurity. So these places are having continued food insecurity, and households are impacted. In places like Ethiopia, where I've recently come from, food insecurity and drought is a cyclical process where every year households are impacted, and as they become impacted year after year, they become more and more vulnerable, and the children in those households become more and more hungry, and the hunger gap in those households becomes longer, and that's something that we all should be concerned about.
How difficult is it for agencies like yours or those that you represent to deliver the aid when there are also regional conflicts which are exacerbating the problem?
I think that is a challenge, but what's important is an approach that is comprehensive and is linked with government strategies and is supported by governments. And so Save the Children works in collaboration with governments around the world, with communities to deliver aid, and has been quite successful. I think what's important to note is that it takes more than food to fight hunger, and you need that political will from governments. You need comprehensive approaches to food insecurity. And that's what Save the Children and other agencies are working toward.
Mark Smulders, do you think there is that political will to try and solve the problem from the countries that are affected? We'll talk about the rich countries that donate money and aid, but from the countries that are affected. Let's take a look at East Africa. We've got problems in Ethiopia with a possible drought. We've got an ongoing civil war for nearly 2 decades in Somalia.
Yeah. No, clearly, I think, again, John and Margaret have put their fingers on the spot. I mean, if this hunger problem has been around for far too long, it's morally simply no longer acceptable. When the economic crisis hit the world, millions, trillions were spent, as we know, to deal with the economic and the financial crisis. We've been saying for years, coming back to John's point, that there is a real cost to hunger. If we don't deal with hunger, economies suffer, households suffer. FAO estimated at some point that the direct cost of the current large numbers of hungry people in the world is about $30 billion a year because of their lack of productivity, the cost of healthcare, etc. So there's a real cost to hunger, but it's a hidden cost that we don't seem to acknowledge very well. But in terms of also taking the appropriate action, we know what must be done. We know we have the methods, the techniques, we know what it takes to reduce the impact of drought. There's irrigation, there's drought-resistant crops varieties.
I was going to say, well, why hasn't it worked? Sorry to interrupt. Why hasn't
it's the political will, indeed, that's often...
Sorry, Mark, why hasn't it worked? I mean, nearly, 30 years ago, we saw a major famine in Ethiopia back in 1984. The world's attention focused on East Africa. Lots of projects, lots of money was thrown at the problem at the time with the thought that it would do some good. And we're back to the same position again. What's gone wrong, or why hasn't it worked?
Well, a lot of it comes down to what we call nowadays food security governance. Yes, we do make efforts, but a lot of it has simply not been enough. The Horn of Africa, indeed, is chronically prone to droughts, and of course there's also been the civil strife and wars that have ravaged the region and haven't helped. So governance that looks at not just pushing through political will at the international level as much as the national level, but it also looks at empowerment of the very people that are affected by hunger and poverty, and an approach that looks much more at how can we help people get themselves out of the predicament they're in. Often simply having a good policy or strategy is just not enough.
Mark Smulders, John Hoddinott, can I just bring you in here, Doctor? I think we just touched on a part that civil strife within nations causes a problem, but if you perhaps go into South Asia, into India and Bangladesh, 40% of children there statistically are said to be undernourished, and there's no recognisable civil strife within India or Bangladesh. They are flourishing democracies to a certain extent. So how do governments, or how are governments able to juggle the whole issue of malnutrition in a situation where there is a stable democracy and yet the people that they represent are still going hungry?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that when we speak of malnutrition, that it is a phenomenon which is multidimensional and which has multidimensional causes. You spoke of very high rates of malnutrition in countries like India and Bangladesh. That reflects in part amongst very poor households, poor access to food. It also reflects poor access to health and things like fresh water. It also reflects, in some cases, poor care practices associated with providing children the right forms of nourishments at the right ages. And then on top of that, there are issues associated with micronutrient deficiencies. This is a lack of things like vitamin A and iodine, iron and zinc in diets. Mm-hmm. What I think is hard for people to recognize sometimes is on some dimensions of malnutrition. In fact, considerable progress has been made, even in countries like India and Bangladesh. In those countries, for example, the prevalence of iodine deficiency, iodine is a micronutrient and its absence causes severe neurological damage, has fallen dramatically in those countries as governments have introduced or ensured iodized salt was available to people. Mm. So when we think of those countries, those functioning democracies, it's probably wrong to say that no progress has been made, but probably better to say that when we're talking about fighting malnutrition, we're talking about a marathon, not a sprint. And it's important to keep our eye on a long-term goal, which is going to take a long time to get there. Well,
the long-term goal certainly has been addressed perhaps by President Obama. Margaret Schuler, can I bring you in here? I mean, he's pledged a great deal of American money to the scenario. $22 billion has been pledged by rich countries recently this year to food security. How difficult is it getting from the pledge to actually getting the money in your hand and being able to utilise it? And do you actually get the full pledge?
Well, I think it's important that there's quick action and follow-up on those pledges. It's commendable that nations have pledged the amount that they have, and I think having a large food security initiative around the globe is important. When you look at what's happened with the large HIV/AIDS initiative, PEPFAR, around the globe, you've had a combination of pledges being met, you've had a combination of political will at the country level, and good solid plans that have impacted a lot of people. And improve the lives of millions of people. And the same type of approach needs to be used with the Global Food Security Initiative. And I think if the donors and the governments and the implementing agencies on the ground, along with communities, implement a very solid plan, I think progress will be made. But it has to be a comprehensive approach, and those pledges have to be met.
It's taken nearly 3 decades, Mark Smulders, if I can bring you in here, to perhaps bring HIV and AIDS to the forefront in the way that perhaps the world now, or certainly a lot of agencies, want to bring food security to the forefront. What do national governments have to do, along most probably with aid agencies, to make that happen?
Well, again, I want to come back to this point on governance because, yes, a lot has been pledged, a lot has been said, policies and programs have been put in place, but often it's the pulling through these programs into real implementation that will actually reach the poor and the hungry at grassroots level. It's all about getting people more involved in the development. It's putting your mouth where your money is, really. And not, well, the other way around, isn't it? You know, money where your mouth is.
Well,
and basically getting some real implementation of projects. A lot of pledges have been made, but often they have not been followed through. Governments formulate programs and policies and strategies, but still insufficient action is actually happening at the ground level.
That does seem to happen.
An example is investment in agriculture, which was at 17% in the early 1980s, and investment in agriculture has gone down to 4% more recently. So it is really a tremendous decline in investment in food production, and which is of course not the only thing. We also need to have access to food, but the production needs to be there in the first place.
Yeah, I was going to. You just touched on a point there. I was going to bring up now with Dr. Hoddinott, was that of course that the EU have recently donated $22 million in grain seed to Zimbabwe to help farmers grow their own crops, therefore not allowing, you might say, Zimbabweans to expect handouts, but actually helping them to produce their own food after quite a lot of civil strife in their own country. Is that the way forward? I mean, we have seen it before. You actually help somebody produce their own food rather than just expect a bag of rice to land on the doorstep.
Well, I think our starting point in this has to be the fact that nobody actually wants to be a recipient of food aid. They would much rather be able to have the ability to grow their own food or to buy it themselves. Zimbabwe, though, going back to Mark Smolder's point, is an excellent example of the consequences of strife and poor governance. 10 years ago, Zimbabwe actually exported grain seeds such as maize to neighboring countries. It had a thriving seed industry, which was destroyed as a result of mismanagement and poor governance over the last decade. There are a number of countries across the world which are now embarking on precisely the programs you're wondering about. For example, in Ethiopia, there is a program called the Productive Safety Nets Program, which twins a provision either of cash or of food to recipients with the building of local public works, things like rehabilitating roads, building irrigation ditches and canals, and also gives farmers access to new agricultural technologies. And where we see farmers getting those packages of technologies and that assistance, we do see them growing more food and we do see their yields rising. So that suggests a model of both working on, as it were, the supply side, giving farmers access to new technologies, and on the demand side, giving poor people access to cash or income or other resources, may be a very effective way of actually dealing in the longer term with the world food crisis.
Margaret Schuler, can I bring you in here? Because obviously we can talk about the officialdom of governments helping or the lack of governance in certain countries. But there are philanthropists as well, such as Bill Gates, for example, who's pledging in recent days $120 million to boost agricultural production, marketing, farming expertise in the developing world. Should individuals like that be taking the lead, or should they, as I think Bill Gates is doing, work with agencies and with governments to help the process of making sure that, for example, malnutrition and good farming techniques do persevere in countries where there are problems?
Yeah, I think that it's okay for people like Bill Gates and others to take a leadership role, because then the world can see that this is an important initiative. But governments and communities need to buy into it. And if there's buy-in, and as I said before, if there's a plan that's comprehensive, then I think that this can work. We certainly need the funds from donors, but we need governments to buy in, and we need comprehensive plans that include more than agriculture production. So agricultural production and improvements to that, things like the productive safety net that was mentioned in Ethiopia, are critical. You need that to be built upon a foundation of good education for women and girls, reduced population growth in some countries, and that comprehensive approach coupled with that donor support will be what takes us forward.
Yeah, of course, that doesn't account for natural disasters, environmental changes or human conflicts, Mark Schmulders. I mean, there is a figure coming out from the World Food Programme suggesting that 70% more food will be required in the coming years as the world's population increases. That is worrying, is it not?
It is indeed, and it's a major challenge too. In fact, there was just a meeting this week in Rome on how we should be feeding the world in 2050, really looking at long-term issues that need to be addressed. And as the population will grow to about 9 billion by 2050, we'll in fact have to double food production. Also because tastes are changing, as populations will get better off, diets will change, more meat will be consumed, and it will simply put a lot of big strain on production systems, let alone climate change and its impact. So there's a major, major challenge ahead, and I think we need to still wake up to these challenges, because I don't think the world is fully aware of what's going to happen in the future. It's obviously even surprises such as the high food prices crisis we had in 2007-8, the economic crisis, these were all unexpected situations, and we need to be better prepared.
Margaret Schuler, has the world woken up, and could we be better prepared, and if so, how?
I think we could be better prepared. I think there is a lack of understanding and a lack of action on key points such as population growth. I think in countries like Ethiopia, where you have significant levels of food insecurity, population growth is significant, and there needs to be a commitment by governments, for example, in countries that are significantly food insecure, to reduce population growth and to improve health systems, to improve agricultural production. And there needs to be pressure from Western governments and donors to those governments, on those governments, so that they do focus on what's important.
Well, my final question for all three of you, and I wonder what you will make of this. I mean, the World Food Summit is to be hosted in Rome in a month's time, and one of those aims, I think, is to commit to halving the world's undernourished by 420 million by the year 2015. Is that a tall order or a realistic target, Mark Schmulders?
It is clearly a tall order, especially since we set out to reach that target many, many years ago, and in fact we have gone in reverse. And so it's a hugely tall order, and but we will want to keep our focus on that number. I mean, if we do not manage to invest and to address the issues now, and to ensure we get the political will and the governance that needs to be put in place to actually bring to the countries most in need the technology we've got, the situation will only get worse. So we have to keep that target in mind. It's a difficult one, but we'll have to keep focusing on the issues.
Sure. Dr. John Hoddinott, your thoughts on that? A tall order or a realistic target?
It is certainly a tall order. It's going to be really tough to reach that figure. But it's important, with that recognition, not to be overly pessimistic. As Mark and Margaret have alluded to already, we have technologies which are being developed, we've got new delivery mechanisms, we've got new actors entering into the food security scene. Although this is a time of great threat, it's also a time of great opportunity. We need financial commitments, we need political will and good governance. But there's no reason why, with all those things in place, the numbers of hungry people cannot be significantly reduced in the years to come.
And Margaret Schuler, the final word. Do you think it's a realistic target or a tall order?
I agree with the others. I think it's a tall order, but I also agree that we need to be optimistic. And I think with the increased focus that the world has given to the Global Food Security Initiative, I think we can make significant progress.
Well, we shall see what happens in the coming days, weeks and years. To all of my guests in Washington, D.C. and in Rome, thank you for your time, and thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. We do welcome your comments and suggestions. Please feel free to email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Until next time, goodbye.